All right. Hello, Ian.
Hi.
Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down today and talk about WoW and Dragonflight.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
My name is Annie. I'm a streamer from Sweden. I play a lot of World of Warcraft. I'm a bit nervous, but I'm really glad to be here to have this opportunity to talk to you, Ian, who is, very well known in the community. And I'm sure everyone who's going to be watching is going to know you. But for those who may not, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ian Hazakostas. I am game director on World of Warcraft. I've been game director for just over 6 years now, and been on the World of Warcraft team for 14 years, and been playing for 18. So it's been really, World of Warcraft has been central to the better part of my life at this point. And yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Let's just jump into the questions then. My first one touching the
All right. We're going to stop and add some context. So Annie is not only a well-known streamer, but is regularly embedded on Wowhead, the kind of one of the premier sites. If you picture taking the capabilities of the Lodestone and of one of the wikis like Gamerscape and putting those together, that's what Wowhead kind of represents within the WoW community compared to the 14 community. And Annie is really big in that space, big within MMOs, is an absolutely massive streamer. Massive streamer. She has completed every single current achievement in World of Warcraft. So her kind of gamer cred score there, very intense within the World of Warcraft space. She has done a lot. So she may not be extreme enough compared to something that a particular community focuses on as a niche, but within just general WoW knowledge, she knows a lot. Ian Hazakostas is, I believe, a lawyer by trade. He helped run a community known as the Elitist Jerks. Think of them as the balanced Discord of their time. And he went to working on the game and is most known for his time as a raid designer, where he designed what is still praised as one of the greatest PvE raids to be added to any video game ever, with Ulduar in Wrath of the Lich King, which is why there is a ton of interest in the Wrath of the Lich King classic experience going on right now. He is not just another thing. He is an ultimate tier raider, an ultimate tier guild organizer, and has done a lot of things and has moved up. And then as he has moved up within the company, he is now a director. But he came from outside of that. That is not the only raid he worked on. That is not the only system, and is now seen as kind of where the buck stops as far as what the systems are in today's day and age. There was a lot of questions over Shadowlands, as we saw a lot of kind of frustration and drama around Blizzard as a company and around the state of the game over the last couple expansions, with how much of that is really Ian's control. Does he have control over things like launch dates of patches or expansions? Does he have limitations on budget when they do big layoffs? How much pushback does he have? Does he get to decide where the money comes from and where it goes? Does he have a lot of control over whether or not there's a BlizzCon? How much money and time they get to spend in QA? And so there's been some questions over recent years on really how much of the game does he end up having control over. But largely over fairly recent history, it has been seen as if you're going to pick any one person that is not named Bobby to blame anything in World of Warcraft on, it is Ian Hazakostas. And that's the goods and the bads.
fated raids. I think the fated raids have been a massive success from all sorts of different kinds of players. I've been hearing a lot of positive feedback on their experience with it. So much better than how in the past it may have been a season that's been lasting for too long with not too much to do, and now we get a bonus season, a new season of Mythic Plus, a new season of PvP, and also to rediscover and re-experience the previous tiers of the expansion. My question to you is, what do you look to improve or change for the future? For example, a thought that I had was potentially bringing back older expansion raids into being fated.
Um, that's a great question. Yeah, overall, we're really happy with how season 4 has played out, and it is exactly as you said. We know that it's. I think it's by design. It's a shorter season. It's a different sort of experience. It's kind of a remix, a greatest hits look back at the expansion as a whole. As we all know that we're moving on to something new very soon, and because of the way our development cycles work, the last raid tier would otherwise tend to last longer. And so this is something the team came up with. So instead of having 8 months in Sepulcher, we could have 5 months in Sepulcher, and then 3 months just taking a grand world tour. I think it's something we are pretty likely to repeat in the future in some form. I don't know that Fated as the exact framing will be the right fit if we do it again. I think that was, themed around the progenitors and their powers and kind of tied to the story of Shadowlands. But some form of, revisiting all the raids with a bit of a remix, a bit of a twist makes sense. We love the idea of revisiting old content and finding ways to keep that relevant. But at the same time, I think we want to be careful about, how we do that, just keeping in mind the fidelity of that content just visually and, how potentially confusing it might be for players, particularly in the raid setting where, unlike a dungeon where we use, revisit old dungeons now in current season 4 and future Dragonflight seasons, you can learn an old dungeon that you've never done pretty quickly. It's, a 20-30 minute experience, 40 minutes on your first time. Whereas when you look back at old raids, there may be a very big difference between people who did those raids when they were current and those who've never done them and have to basically do completely fresh progress from scratch on a limited schedule. That may be more stressful than what we really are aiming for with this type of season. We do want to continue to expand our time walking raids as a system, as a way of, revisiting that old content in a bit more, stress-free, light way. One thing we definitely want to improve, I think one area where we just kind of let our players down with season 4 is outdoor focused players. If you were focused on dungeons, if you're a raider, if you PvP, it was a great new season with rewards to chase. If you're someone who mostly plays in the outdoor world, I guess you had a world boss every week, and other than that, it was just a few more months of Zereth Mortis. So I think that if we do this sort of season again, we would definitely want to include a meaningful outdoor component so that there's progression for all of our players.
Interesting. Yeah, I think.
Okay, so they tackled a lot there. So Ian touched on, first of all, kind of like this idea of season. From a Final Fantasy standpoint, think of that like a patch. And from a Guild Wars 2 standpoint, think of that like a living season. This is kind of the last one going into expansion. And in a vertical progression game like World of Warcraft, there is a real question to why care. That is why in Guild Wars you avoid that by just being lateral in the first place. In Final Fantasy XIV, the reason you care is because it's the easiest time to go back and do a lot of this. So when we end up with this really long 0.5 and 0.55 cycle in a Final Fantasy XIV expansion, you end up with the relic weapon hitting best in slot for its first time all expansion. So casual players who prefer to put lots of time into something that's relatively kind of easier to acquire than something like Savage or Ultimate, you end up with those people being very, very powerful. It is also when we see things like Echo added. At this point, they've been added to kind of lots of raids across the expansion. So if you want to go back and start at the beginning of the expansion's raids, you could kind of beat them in order synced, and you would be incredibly powerful. They're incredibly well documented. So it is a chance to go, maybe at that point, begin farming all the extremes from the expansion. Maybe you haven't been doing any of them, and you go start farming the expansions from that standpoint. It's also a great time that all of the different leveling systems across the expansion have been added. So depending on what you want to level and how you want to level it, there's probably a lot of ways to get it from 80 to 90 if you've been kind of ignoring that the whole expansion. So it tends to be this backward focused victory lap where mostly the story kind of wraps up and leaves us on a cliffhanger going into the expansion story, and you've got a lot of time to just hang out. But there's so much hype around it. You've come out of the 3 fan fests at that standpoint. You've got all this hype about what's coming. And so everybody wants to be playing Final Fantasy, but nobody has a reason to be playing Final Fantasy. So it's a great chance for the community to rally around things like getting people through ultimates that have never cleared them, going back and taking victory laps through Savages. And so it ends up being this moment where the community gets to kind of make their own fun. But it is a fairly unique time, and you don't want that time to exist all expansion, because it mostly exists because there's a lack of real reason to do anything beyond hit level cap and have easily acquirable gear already equipped. So you don't want the entire expansion to be filled with there's nothing to do, make your own fun. They need to be doing their job as devs. We just understand it during that point in the life cycle because the new stuff is being worked on. It's just not available yet. And it's all being tied to this massive drop within the massive dumps that expansions are. So that was kind of the first point he talked about. The second is, as he started to talk about faded raids and all that, and when you talk about raids in Mythic Plus, that's where 14 and WoW start to function so differently that there's not an exact translation there. But one of the points he hit on was She asked, can we go back and better leverage old content? There is no game in existence that has more raid encounters available across more difficulties than World of Warcraft. Total number of boss encounters for 10 or more players, there is no game in existence that comes anywhere close to what World of Warcraft has to offer in their backlog. Yet one of the frustrations is that there is very little reason to go back and regularly engage with it. So the question is, could we go back and do that as we start to see their hard dungeon content, their 5-man stuff, go back and leverage old dungeons within their Mythic Plus difficulty? Could we start to go back and visit that beyond just the time walking? Time walking acts as this kind of smaller, almost minigame version that has its own currency and all of that, and that's great. It acts kind of like the Final Fantasy XIV roulette system, and you're starting to see this kind of echoed version within Guild Wars that further enhances a certain raid each week to highlight it, though that like buff that makes you better maybe doesn't matter so much in some encounters, because some encounters it's you just have to do the thing, so giving you more life won't help if there's like a one-shot mechanic. Like if you're going to get knocked off the platform, it's not going to matter how much life you have. So you got to just be better. Stop triggering bombs that put black over the entire arena for everybody. Buffing won't help with that. But it does generally encourage people to feel a little less scared to jump in. And time walking somewhat does that, but time walking does not go back to what Ulduar was. That's really one of the successful points of Classic, is it's been one of the only ways to truly level backwards content within World of Warcraft ever. It's been the first real time to do that. And so when people ask what the appeal of Classic is, some of that appeal absolutely makes sense when you look at Final Fantasy players who are just now doing Ultimate Coil of Bahamut for their very first time. When you look at all the excitement about Living Season 1 being re-released into Guild Wars 2 for the first time. And so when you look at this like idea of we're going back in time within our current game, World of Warcraft has been particularly poor at that. And so when people ask why do people play Classic, just understand that that's something that Final Fantasy and Guild Wars fans are getting in game right now, that WoW has had to spin up a second client to truly do well. And the question is, can retail make a step towards doing that better? And largely the answer here is no. Largely the answer is it's too hard for people to know how to play. WoW has built themselves to be dependent on add-ons, and what that's allowed for as a pro is for encounters to be very, very, very unique and very engaging. Every expansion, every patch has a chance to add raid encounters that function a little bit differently than anything we've seen before, and visually a lot different than we've seen before. Maybe it's a different shape arena, maybe the ice looks like blue puddles on the ground as opposed to the toxic stuff looks like green stuff on the ground, and you've had to instead in like Final Fantasy to work around that, where largely all stack icons are a giant arrow telling everybody to freaking stack. So when people say, I don't like that when WoW, they just have like an add-on telling them what to do. Our UI tells us what to do when we play Final Fantasy XIV. WoW's doesn't. And so the add-on's just stepping in and doing that. And if people don't like how much DBM does it, then the add-on, then the core developers of the game need to start doing better at making the native cover some of that ground. Because when it's, I don't get any indicator from World of Warcraft, or I have to get all the indicators of a third party, it kind of pushes me towards the third party, as opposed to I get some indicators or I get all the indicators. You start to see people in 14 say, why do people do that? It's good enough without. And so as a result, you've ended up with these really cool, really engaging, really immersive fights that are tied to those expansions. You've ended up with these combat systems that have changed drastically from expansion to expansion, loot systems that have changed drastically from expansion to expansion, and sometimes even within an expansion. That's really fun when you're current, but what that means compared to a game like Guild Wars or Final Fantasy, whose combat systems and loot systems have changed slowly over time, but are largely still representative of what they once were, is that it's very, very hard to go back to a time when combat systems were totally different, when loot systems were totally different. It's really, really hard to leverage that backwards content. So he basically said, there's no way to catch those people up. And what that immediately tells me is you would need to go back and start building a native DBM. You would start by building that for current fights and be better about making current fights have a design language where your UI can step in and do some of what Deadly Boss Mod style add-ons have done so that people feel less tied to those add-ons in current content. And then you would take those very same systems, those very same methods of communication where a stack is a stack, attack, a bomb is a bomb. The ground effect is communicated in a way that is accessible and is reasonable and has options like colorblind modes. And then you would go backwards and start applying those to old encounters. And you would say, okay, let's pick a standalone encounter like Onyxia, and let's go make Onyxia have communications. And it might mean that you have to do things like what Final Fantasy has done, where they went back and redid some of the old dungeons as they cleaned them up. As they went back and took a stab at making some of those a better experience because they wanted the dungeons to be something you could do with their AI system, not that different than the Exile's Reach system within World of Warcraft. It felt like, okay, while we're here, some of these mechanics, they're never used again, and they're not wildly fun on their own, and they're just confusing to new players. So what if we just reimagined this boss encounter to be something that was a little more on theme with all the tools and resources and knowledge we have today, and then use that as a building block? And so now you say, Onyxia is actually something you can enjoy while leveling, or Onyxia is something you can enjoy before going into the current tier raids, and the things you learn through that encounter will be better. But that's a drastic undertaking. So I think largely he just said that's not possible. There is also something about, like, there's elements about what happens at the end of an expansion that's really fun, and some of what he said is we'd love to do that again, but we don't want to do it in exactly the same way. But his reasons for not doing it exactly the same way were tied to the lore reasons that they got to do it, and that doesn't matter in my opinion. Saying, well, it wouldn't make sense within the lore that we got extreme versions again, because in Final Fantasy XIV, extreme versions, lore-wise, canonically are explained that there is a bard who, like the bard in The Witcher, sings songs about how great you are, and they're elaborated, they're exaggerated, and going through the extreme versions of fights is us getting to play through it as that bard imagined it. Now imagine, canonically, we killed off the bard. The bard died in an expansion. Well, I guess we can't have extremes anymore because the bard can't sing it to me. No. Put them in the game and come up with a new reason that we get to do extremes. One of the sets of extremes was because somebody wanted to imagine it within like a hologram system or whatever. Go tie it to a different system. You can canonically explain it however you want. That's a you problem. What we're saying is I like getting extremes and I want to keep getting extremes moving forward. And there are some fights in the past that did not remain relevant, and I'd love for you to go back and bring those forward too, because those really help when the game hits a dry spell or has a patch cycle that's not your thing, or is a new player that wants to consume content really, really fast while they're excited about this new game they're playing and is consuming it faster than you can release it. Old content is an advantage that existing veteran games should be taking a massive advantage of. You should never be saying, is the 1.7 Brimstone Sand update for New World better than the current 10.1 patch of Dragonflight? That shouldn't matter, because yes, it's interesting to compare those, but ultimately World of Warcraft to go, oh, 10.1's not your thing? Did you go back and leverage any of the other 15 years of content we have? Like, they should be able to beat the living crap out of New World when it comes to good content, because even when they miss the mark on a current patch, they should be able to leverage their back catalog. Use your strength, WoW.
I think it's nice to hear that you guys are trying to think about all the different kinds of players, and it's a good point. Bringing back an old raid would feel quite stressful, since it is usually, or it seems like it would be a shorter season naturally. So that actually does make sense. I noticed the Shadowlands raid portals, the ones that you unlock when you clear them on Fated Mythic. I noticed that they're account wide. I was happy and unexpectedly discovered on my alts that I had those portals there. And my question to you is, how come the portals that you get for completing Mythic Plus 20 dungeons, how come those are not account wide?
I agree, it's a little bit of a quirk. It can seem like an inconsistency. I think philosophically, the vast majority of things these days that are cosmetic or utility are account wide. Really, some of the only exceptions have been some of the very highest end PvP rewards and some of the very highest end dungeon rewards, going all the way back to challenge mode armor and weapons from Mists. And in some ways, Mythic Plus is the successor to that system. The original philosophy there is some of the sense that, the class that you completed that accomplishment on when you're in a small scale PvP or dungeon setting is very important. And that when you're showing off some benefit, whether it's, a unique mount or having access to a teleport like this, it's a reflection on the fact that you did it as a mage or you did it as a priest, where in a raid group, it's inherently just a larger, more cooperative endeavor. I realize that reasoning is pretty flimsy. I think to some extent it's like this because it's always been like this. And it's definitely the sort of thing that we could revisit as we look to the future, particularly if we do these types of things more often.
Yeah, and this.
Okay, so the question effectively could be broadened to why is so little of World of Warcraft account-wide? It is something they've gotten better at over the years. We've gotten various quest lines that you no longer have to complete on alts. That's something that didn't exist back in the day. We have a lot of account-wide things, and looking to Dragonflight, there's a lot more account-wide in general. But the question is, why is it still inconsistent? Now, Final Fantasy was asked this question about trial loot. Why is some of it able to be broken down into its components through the desynthesis method, which is like disenchanting gear in World of Warcraft, or the scrapper, or something like that, or salvaging gear in Guild Wars 2. And the question is, why is some of it able to be broken into its crafting components and some of it not? And the dev response was not, let me give my flimsy reason. The dev response was, I hadn't really thought about that. And now that I have thought about it, it doesn't really make sense. So I think we're going to fix that. And then they did. And now they said we went internally and we debated, should there be a rule where all trials of a certain type are and all trials of a certain type aren't? And we decided no, it should be a universal rule so that when you're in this type of content, you know it will be. Okay. Now, do we want trial loot to be something you can break down across the board, knowing that it means people will farm it up? Or do we think that that is not something that we want to become a source of those crafting components? No, I think we do. So now, what we are responsible in doing is we are responsible to go back, and sometimes in Final Fantasy history, they can flip a switch and do it across the board in one patch. Sometimes they have to do something over several patches, or they have to do something all in one go, like an upcoming change in 6.3, and say, we're going to do it all in one go. It's not going to be perfect. Let us know where there are bugs. We'll fix them. But they ultimately said, it's all going to be something we can break down. What Ian should have said here is, as we aim for the game to be more account-wide, as we blur the lines between factions so people can play the faction they want, as we blur the lines between class and race locks so that people can play the class and the race they want as a combination, as we increase the number of sources of heirlooms, we invest in things like allied races, and we start to look to more account-wide unlocks on general account-wide progression things, such as Renown moving into Dragonflight. We are aware that there are still going to be some things that are not account-wide and some are. This is something that has been slow to change over World of Warcraft's history, but is changing. And moving forward, we will continue to look at those systems one at a time. What I think is important to me, Ian, which obviously I can't understand that you should always have your eye level at roughly 2/3 of a camera. So if you are kind of framing, that's what Annie does. You'll notice somewhere in that 2/3 range. But if we're going to be Ian. So to me, Ian, what I think should be done is that I think we should look at possibly whether or not those things can be, but be aware that we still want to maintain that if something earns a reward on a particular class or a particular character or a particular race, that every once in a while we celebrate that as well. If there is something that is special about that, we want to maintain that other players can tell, that that player can tell, that this is the class or the character that they did that thing on. I think that's important. And that's fine. But to simply say, let me state this reason, and I'm already acknowledging to you that it's flimsy, I think is a little bit frustrating. And as a game that has a lot of replayability to it, and it is not always fun and engaging to do something a second or a third or a fourth time, it would be really nice to see that progression be something that's more generally account-wide as the general rule, and then the exception be applied to things that are very clearly the exception, such as class and order halls. Class and order halls, it wouldn't make sense for all of my class halls to progress because one class progressed. That doesn't make any sense. And in its very nature, that's very clearly presented. I don't have to ask. So if there is not a very clear and concise reason for why a class does something, or an armor type does something, the fact that transmog is something that is unlocked by the armor type, that makes sense from the get-go. But something like portals, something, things that you might come to the same place and you want to try it. Imagine if somebody is all the way up at Mythic 20s or 25s on their main, they're getting through their first Mythic bosses on the raid, and they want to try doing Mythic Plus on another class. That should be something that's encouraged, and anything that's in the way of that, such as attunements, such as Torghast or Maw grinds, fast travel points, flying unlocks, anything that gets in that person's way is a negative. Because what that person is telling you is my pre-organized group is having fun on these days, clearing the time-gated, high-difficulty content, and I want to play your game more, and I don't always want to have to play it at the level that progresses my main. I'm willing to go back and play in a more casual way, and that should be celebrated. They should be excited. That's your monthly active user number. Somebody saying, hey, my Mythic Plus group decided they're going to take the rest of this season off, I'd be willing on messing around on another class. Things like rep vendors and stuff like that, as a general rule, should all be account-wide, because there's no reason to gate somebody who says, I just want to try playing your game in a different way that you built. You built all these classes and specs. What if I wanted to try all 38? You invested in all 38. Shouldn't you be excited? But instead, well, you'd really have to go back and start at the beginning. The general rule should be account-wide, account-wide, account-wide.
This is why I was surprised to see it. I did not expect the raid ones to be account-wide either, so that's why the question came up. So it's interesting. I'd be happy to see some, potential more account-wide looks on that as well. Another little bit more general thing here is over time, I've found myself removing add-ons for significant in-game updates. So for example, with Shadowlands, the notable one for me was the auction house revamp. And now with Dragonflight, we have the UI updates. That for me meant that I removed a lot of my add-ons, especially the ones that were, on action bars. My question was if you have any other features that you would be happy to talk about or share that might, potentially replace some other popular add-ons.
This is something we're actually kind of eagerly listening to community feedback around, and it's exactly discussions like these, feeling like the new UI is great, but it has this one flaw that I feel like I need to fix with an add-on, or there's this one thing missing, and we want to get a sense of what the kind of most common examples of those are to help inform where we focus our future efforts, so it benefits the most people. One example off the top of my head, which is pretty small, but I think it is something probably missing from our UI, is the ability to view or interact with like the common map coordinate systems that a lot of add-ons use. Or if you go to Wowhead, it ends up being it's something that like you often just see players commonly sharing these around. And if you're not using a specific add-on, you don't know what they mean or how to interact with them. And while it's something that was never a basic part of the game, it's become so widespread that it feels like players more broadly would benefit from being able to have that. Otherwise, I think the one thing that we're not looking to do, first off, add-ons remain a key part of WoW. We want to make sure players have the ability to customize their experience. That's not going away. Things like, DBM or bigwigs, or, fully sort of informational, computational problem-solving add-ons, that's not something we're looking to replicate with the base UI. We're looking, we want to provide that information. Certainly things that weak auras might do in terms of making it more obvious when you've had a class proc fire or when a boss is about to use an ability. Those sorts of things, yes, the base UI should do adequately. But things that are like putting markers over enemies' heads or helping, assign or solve a problem, that feels like it would almost be defeating the purpose of the puzzles we present if the game solved them for you.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, actually.
So, okay. So, add-ons. If you have a wildly precise UI from a time that the game offered very little to you in ways to modify that, such as LVUI or shadow unit frames or something like that, they're not rebuilding those. And so people who have played the game the same way, super precisely that way for 10 years, the new UI updates we're never going to capture you. You're just going to download that because what you want is so precise that they can never satisfy you, right? He's talking about big, broad strokes. But this is massive for players that have been flexible with their UI and are flexible with their UI, who can now run less add-ons. I find myself already running less add-ons. B, this now redefines the new player experience, which takes me into his second point. His second point is, what types of add-ons do we want to see things go more native versus not? Final Fantasy has this struggle all the time. Every time there's a big add-on gate type moment where a bunch of people in the community get bans for using add-ons because they're across the board not allowed, then the devs say, well, what do you want to see from add-ons? And then they implement those features. And so then it feels like, so you're rewarding the people who do add-ons by moving the UI in that direction, but then you're punishing the people that gave you the lesson you learned. It's odd. It's hard. It's a hard topic to navigate, and it comes up time and time again. It comes up every time there's a big community event around it. So it's possible that in the upcoming 6.31, with the addition of the 5th Ultimate to the game, that we're going to see it again, because there's going to be people that stream, and those people are going to use add-ons, and then those add-ons are going to get bans, and then it's going to keep happening. Within World of Warcraft, add-ons are permitted, but there are base things such as map coordinates that for some reason aren't in the native UI, and knowing where something is in a way that can be communicated to players without having to join their party or anything like that. I want to look up where this quest giver is. Map coordinates are very, very, very helpful. So base UI is something that if you're going to have a map, I should be able to do it. And ideally in a way where my mini map tells me where I am, but when I'm on my main map, my cursor has one as well, so that I can mark that, so I can go in and flag something. This is something that I can do with add-ons. It is not something I can do natively. However, he is then drawing the line at what happens when players start to use add-ons to go so far that they are now neutering something that the developers worked very hard to put in the game. We worked very, very hard to make something a puzzle or a rewarding experience, and somebody has found a way to make an add-on make this relatively mindless. The puzzle element has been stripped out of the game, and we feel that takes something away that we wanted to build. The problem is that by saying that you will do, you won't ever do a DBM as it sits, they will always exist. Like, by not meeting them halfway, they will exist, because there are players that need them because of accessibility reasons. There are players that need them because the number of hours that they play in a week is small and they want to see progress, and you have tuned something harder than their particular group can solve the puzzle. And people might answer that by saying, well, then they should just get better. They're not going to. They're going to download the add-on and they're just going to clear the fight. There is a solution and they can hit download. So they're going to do that. It's way better for them seeing clears. And so you can like it or not, that's what's going to happen. So when he says we're trying to get better, I think that then his answer pivots to weak auras, which is the right answer. If you want to see DBM go away, have the base UI continue to get better, and have things like weak auras try to get better. What the hell is weak auras? Weak auras is an add-on that allows you to start to have the game help communicate things in ways that help you put a priority on something. That's a generalized, massive 10,000 foot overview. So imagine if in Guild Wars or in Final Fantasy XIV that you are trying to get better at your rotation. And so you are a Bladesworn warrior in Guild Wars 2, and you are a warrior in Final Fantasy XIV. Well, there are big moments, such as I want to make sure that when I'm in an encounter, I'm always charging up my bullets and burning my bullets when I can. But I'm ideally burning my bullets once it's kind of like the new Evoker thing in World of Warcraft, where it charges all the way up. I want to use it when it's full, and then I also want to trigger it every time it's available. Imagine if in Final Fantasy XIV, I wanted to use Inner Release every time it was available, or every time the Storm's Eye buff falls off, I want to put it back up. Well, right now, you are looking at a bunch of things on screen that are blinking and all of that, and there is no way to make that one thing a priority. And yet, with something like weak auras, you could. And so it would be very, very, very easy to have it change or manipulate my UI in a way that makes sense to me, when something like my food buff falls off, or a particular cooldown is available, or I am doing something that I either don't want to be doing, I'm doing something bad, or I'm doing something good. I want it to help indicate where I'm at, and I want it to manipulate my UI in a way that helps me. You either have to design a system that's so mind-numbingly easy across the board to understand that everybody gets there, or you need to create flexibilities in the system to turn down and up things. So this might be something like having multiple layers of what spell effects look like. I want to turn down everybody else's spell effects except the ones that affect me. How do I decide what those ones are? How do I whitelist, effectively saying, I want to know what those are? As a healer, I want to see the spell effects of other healers because that visually tells me where heals are going off in the room, right? These sorts of things are things that it would be a lot of work for them to try to mimic this. I want buffs that are on people to be larger if they're ones that are helpful. Instead of a game being show other people's buffs, make mine larger, or don't show theirs at all. I want something that helps me manipulate the game where it can help me play better. Not tell me how to play, but play better. And this is something that a lot of times people start with something like weak auras, but ultimately DBM does a great job of. DBM does a great job of, at a base level, helping people focus on the things they need to focus on. The problem is that by the game doing none of it, turning on DBM at a base level also turns on DBM at a high level. So there might be things that you're willing to solve, you're willing to focus, like the fire elemental needs to die before the snow elemental. You might be willing to do that just from understanding the encounter. But instead of help me see what target I'm focusing, the two most important targets in the room, it is now also going to yell at you if you're targeting the wrong thing. It is somebody sitting over your shoulder shouting at you. So it takes it way, 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 way too far. So if you don't want DBM to be in game, you have to kind of come part of the way. Because as it sits right now, the idea of playing World of Warcraft at a really high level without DBM on or with DBM on is a massive gap. It's a massive gap. And I would like to see them kind of blend that. The other thing you can do is start to help players feel comfortable solving problems on their own. I really like when there's things that the DBM's not particularly good at, but they are particularly easy to solve. And so I think things like, you know, and players may not like these, but I think things like there was a kind of a garden maze dungeon in, I think that was Shadowlands. I think that's this expansion. There was a garden maze one that you needed to kind of pay attention to what the monsters were doing to decide which door was the trick door or it spawned more ads. I think I think the Kieran Tour dailies, I think giving people a place where they can gamify getting better at the base mechanics is good. World of Warcraft doesn't do this very well. Final Fantasy does it incredibly well through their roulette system. You are constantly being encouraged to go back and run old dungeons or go run these open world fights that teach you stack when you stack, turn, look away when you're supposed to look away, be in close to the boss or be outside of the boss, or there will be consequences. But they're not that big of consequences. If you do it poorly, you do it poorly. But if you want to get better at the game, you can. And I think World of Warcraft can continue to lean into those. They've done some of them, but continue to lean into that so that players feel comfortable, you know, kind of taking off the training wheels. I think Final Fantasy could get better because they don't allow any form of internal damage meter. And that's one of the few areas where there is a big discrepancy between people that know how to play and people that don't. Guild Wars, the difference between somebody that is doing their rotation correctly and somebody that isn't. People look at the UI and they go, there's 12 buttons. Okay, well then how come that person's doing literally 10 times the damage? Literally 10 times. It's a massive difference. So people that just come in the game and just button mash it, they're like, yo, this game's super easy. They're doing 10 times your damage. And so I think these games, feedback is something that if you don't allow add-ons, you have to take it on yourself. And that's why add-ons have an advantage. You have these basically unpaid devs. They might be paid by the community, but they're not paid by you, doing something that your game, it would be really hard to solve for each and every one of what ultimately becomes, over time, millions of players.
I was thinking in terms of the things that you just mentioned with weak auras, like being able to customize how you see your procs, for example. I think that would be really interesting. So yeah, that's an answer I like. So good to hear. Good to hear. Another general question, sort of. I've noticed the accessibility improvements in the game over the last couple expansions. We have the recent controller support updates. We have the directional targeting system that's coming in Dragonflight, and the interact with target keybind, which I just recently discovered and played around with. So my question is WoW coming to console in Dragonflight?
No plans for that at this point. I think there's a lot. WoW is a game that at its core was designed for PC, and that's not just the interface; it's also how it's delivered, and even including things like add-ons. But a lot of the focus on controller support really has been with an eye towards accessibility, and people who have a challenging time using keyboard and mouse controls, but can use a wide variety of accessibility controllers if we support them. And so we're just very excited to have been able to do more and more of that.
Yeah, no, it's been really nice to see because, as you say, there's people who use a controller by a PC. People have potentially the setup connected to a big monitor. So it's nice to see that, being able to go back and forth between keyboard, mouse, and controller as well.
Okay, so how have they done this? Because I think to a lot of people, hearing there's controller support in WoW sounds really foreign. So they've been doing it slowly. So with the introduction of Shadowlands, they basically put it in console commands. So it felt like a hidden hack. So it felt like a kind of an up, down, left, right, select, start type thing. And so ultimately what it acted as is kind of a better backbone for things like the console add-ons that people have used. Because if you could figure that out, you could probably also figure out how to just download something that's kind of key mapping. But ultimately that system still ended up weak within things like targeting, where the game needs to give the tools, and so the game kind of needs to help. And so adding an action camera is something that we are seeing come in Dragonflight, and that makes a big difference. And that really helps with like targeting quest givers and things like that, where those of us can do it with a mouse or, and 14 in addition to that has filters. Like when you tab target, what does that cycle through? And do you have something like shift tab bound where you can like go backwards through the list? And so there are people that, heal entirely with their keyboard and toggle through the different party members, keeping in mind that raids really cap out at 8 players, so that's a little easier than like toggling through 20. But it is something that people manage to do because of the way that the interface has the options to work for keyboard and mouse players, but also for controller players. Within this, they've also built on this, where in Dragonflight, if you're going to use the word accessibility, also be aware that the colorblind modes now have a base version implemented. It's not perfect. It's not every single version of kind of what people need as far as accessibility, but it is a massive leap forward for a game that has largely left that to add-ons or not at all. It does feel like something that if you want to see growth verticals within a game that's been around this long, you have to start to ask, yes, there are new players coming to PC every day. Yes, there are people that are new to WoW every day. But if you want to increase your growth rate, you need to appeal to markets that have historically you've just ignored all of them. So that is people who exclusively play on controller for any number of reasons, or who exclusively just prefer controller. So they don't tend to stick with games that require keyboard and mouse. That also is other platforms. World of Warcraft is supported on Mac, as opposed to, I've been comparing it to Final Fantasy and Guild Wars. Guild Wars used to have a Mac version, does not. Final Fantasy has a Mac version. It runs worse, and you have to buy a separate code, but it is cross-play, cross-save. WoW has always run great on Mac, and so that helps you with all the people who have a keyboard, mouse, and computer in front of them, regardless of kind of the two primary big operating systems out there. But it does mean that you've left everybody behind that is anywhere different. So as you start to see things like a Microsoft, acquisition come in, you have to wonder if Blizzard and Activision devs were not already aware that if we could go to consoles, Xbox, PlayStation, across the board, if we could go run via cloud, maybe we could be on tablet, this would start to be something where there would be a whole group of players who have never had access to our game because they don't have a PC. Yes, we've made sure that the PC minimum specs is basically a 2013 microwave, but ultimately they don't have access to one. So we've lowered the minimum specs as much as we can. We've kept them as low as we can, but there are people who just don't have a gaming PC. We need to make sure this is something that can run. As a lot of these games have chosen not to embrace some of these cloud streaming services like NVIDIA GeForce Now or Google Stadia when that was a thing, it feels odd that they stayed away from those. That felt like something, you have a player base that's willing to spend money on a subscription and is willing to have a good internet connection as part of their base requirements. So it feels like cloud gaming is uniquely structured to be something that benefits a perpetually online subscription-based game like Final Fantasy or World of Warcraft. But for some reason, they've tended to stay away from those so far. Console is the last frontier. Console is like the fast food chains all making a clamor for breakfast over the last several years. It's a growth vertical that they are missing a lot of players from. Yes, many console players do own a PC, but not all console players own a PC. So having console support would be massive. Final Fantasy XIV chooses to tie theirs exclusively to the PlayStation system. Elder Scrolls Online has done a great job supporting that. For some reason, Guild Wars is not on console. For some reason, World of Warcraft is not on console. I understand that like add-ons won't run over there and you want people to have that universal experience, but as your UI gets to where add-ons are less and less required, it would be really nice if I was just going to do something mindless, like go clear quests in old zones or something for a lore master achievement. It would be really nice if I could go do that while sitting on my couch with cross-play, cross-save. That would be awesome. So I do wonder if Activision Blizzard has not already been aware of just how great it would be. You know, they have things like Diablo supported over on like the Switch, for goodness sakes. It would be great to see WoW make that move. And maybe a Microsoft acquisition puts enough leadership in the room to say, also, can the base version of WoW that gets you all the way up to the current expansion be included in Game Pass? Can we start to see this pressure where it's not just people want it and people see the value in it, but an overwhelming number of people internally want it and see the value in it? Because I think WoW would be great on console. I think it would be amazing on console. Absolutely incredible. And Guild Wars, my goodness, your game runs on like 12 buttons. Why the heck are you not already on console?
So something that's inventory related. Shadowlands came with a lot of items in the game, which bloats our inventory quite a bit. I saw a wiki page the other day that listed 100 different anima item sources. Not sure how accurate that is, but many of them which contain an identical amount of anima even. And then we also had the research items in Korthia and several Covenant-specific items, such as the seeds for the Queen's Conservatory. So my question is, are you guys planning to be a bit nicer to our bags in Shadowlands? In Dragonflight.
Yes. Yes. I think it's something we experience as pain points ourselves. And, one of the ways we have to deliver progression systems or collections or whatever ends up being inventory. The challenge is when 6 or 7 different systems or multiple designers are doing things that involve putting items in your bags, suddenly, you're overwhelmed. One of the big things we've done in Dragonflight is adding the all-new reagent bag to pull all of that stuff completely out of the inventory space into its own very large, section. And I think that should go a long way towards helping. But ultimately, we need to just be careful with the systems that we design, with the outdoor loops, because often if you're just killing things around the world and before you know it, your bags are full, we're right back where we started, even if we gave you more space.
Yeah, I did notice.
Okay. It is not large. The initial reagent bag provided to us is 20 slots. Wowhead says that we're going to get like 36 next expansion. This is meant to be like all the crafting loot that is available kind of in-game. If you are not moving to something like a material storage system out of Guild Wars 2, it is not large. It will never be large. 30 slots is a band-aid. It's people adding sites. It's them adding slots to the Glamour Dresser in Final Fantasy XIV. It's adding a new larger bag to any of these games. It is a band-aid. It is just a matter of time until that is yet again full. It is always full. What they have done that has actually made a substantial difference in the size of our inventory is the collections tab. The collections tab at this point in the game, if you go compare it to like base vanilla, includes all of your pets, all of your mounts, all of your heirloom, all of your toys. This stuff makes a huge difference. Cosmetic systems and things like this is massive. Absolutely massive. The other thing they have done over time, controversial, it has pros and cons, is they've given us the ability to deal with loot in more places. The Katie stamp whistles, the grand mammoths, the yaks, the brutosaurs, these abilities to deal with things out in the world and deal with them right then and there means that we are sometimes able to beat back inventory long enough that, like the snooze button, it says, yes, I'm gonna have to go back to town eventually. Loot forcing you back to town as a general game loop portion is healthy. We should be encouraged to go back and have an option to log out. We should be encouraged to go back and have an option to see other players and be reminded of that. There should be intermissions baked into games. That's a good thing, and it acts as a lobby type thing to kind of force us back to Oribos or Orgrimmar or something like that, where we get to go back and pause for a second. This is healthy. So the game saying there should be one eventually is fine, but they've said, okay, maybe it was originally you were going to have your inventory fill up at an hour, but thanks to the mammoth, you can hold out for an hour and a half. That's great. The last thing they've done is currency tabs. So as we start to see games move towards these kind of currency tab type systems where certain large, long-term useful things that you're going to have thousands of can pile up in your currency tab. This would be a great thing for things like quest items to funnel off into, because quest items are something where you really don't know how long you're going to be holding on to it. Final Fantasy uses the term key item. And so having quest items continue to do that, sometimes in WoW that kind of handles itself where it feels like the quest has like an interactable thing done from your quest log, and it's not an item that I feel like is in my inventory. So having the quest have interactables not take up inventory space means that you're not suddenly having these like temporary stand-ins that are kind of like coming in and borrowing your inventory space temporarily. That's really frustrating, especially when like a friend hops online and wants to go do a particular piece of content like Dungeon Run, which generates inventory, and you're kind of put pause on something like quests and you end up with this. Guild Wars handles this by having quests. They do drop trophies, but those are largely tossable when you're not immediately going back to that renown heart, but even their quest log clears itself out. Final Fantasy has a key item separate tab. World of Warcraft's handled this to mixed results over the years, but having different items like that. So I would love to see some of these items kind of shift in the way they're used. Maybe it's that like Hearthstones become something that's a spell, so it can be dragged to a slot on my bar, but is not something, or it can go be part of the toy system, where if I don't want to have it in my inventory, I don't have to. So the Dalaran Hearthstone is something that I could pull out of the toys when I want to use it, and I'm using it regularly, but when I don't, I feel like I can better toss. And I can get access to it when I realize I want to go back to my garrison or something like that. These are things that like meaningfully move it in the other direction, not simply kick the goalpost out and say, well, it's no longer a problem right now. So inventory is just a continued problem in games, because if the game doesn't drop loot, it doesn't feel rewarding. But if it drops too much loot, it feels like we're now being penalized for that. And that feels really uncomfortable in a game like Guild Wars, when at the same time the developers are selling you inventory space. Their problems with their inventory would be there whether or not they were, but it doesn't feel good when they're literally coming forward and offering you a monetary solution to your problem.
The reagent back, and I really like it because it does affect things like, for example, the crafting materials in Zereth Mortis. I noticed how they immediately went into that, so that was really nice to see. Good change. Moving on to a bit more to do with achievements and collecting. So as someone who recently hit 100% achievements this expansion and will be attempting to reach 100% in Dragonflight, there's one achievement I'm looking at, the 2000 pets collected achievement. So I'm nearly missing 500 pets, and I have all of the ones that are currently obtainable. And my question is, are we going to hit this in Dragonflight?
That's a good question. It's something we need to revisit. We need to make sure, so some of those may have been made just kind of forward looking, anticipating where we were going to go. But philosophically, there should not be achievements in the game that aren't currently earnable. Like, even if it wasn't going to be earnable until, let's say, patch 10.2 or whatever, we still shouldn't have that in the game before it's possible to get it. So we're definitely going to look back at those numbers.
Oh, interesting. So even if it's obtainable later in the expansion, it would still not be in the game yet, so to say.
Like, philosophically, yes. I mean, I think, coming from your perspective, right? Like, it's not fair to have this thing dangling in front of you that you can't quite read what you do. It's like, all right, you're at 99.8% completion because there's an impossible one. Just wait. That's not how the system should work.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so achievements and things like that. This is something that I think Final Fantasy does to mixed degrees, because they don't have this. But I think World of Warcraft actually does a better job across the board. First of all, there are unique obtainables tied to all sorts of things, both in and out of game. They have a feats of strength system where an achievement can be worth achievement points at some point and then maybe later isn't, or anything once it becomes no longer available automatically gets cycled down into. And so what that means is ultimately achievement points, we should all be operating on roughly the same number. Final Fantasy does not do this. Guild Wars, it's heavily time gated, so it ends up being something where like it feels kind of punishing, but their achievement system is overall so much better than either of the other two games that it's hard to say that without like with a straight face and not admit that like what they're doing is ultimately pretty amazing. World of Warcraft has the achievement system largely that you can acquire every achievement in game at any given time, but she is pointing to one of the rare exceptions, and he is saying what I expected to the answer to the earlier stuff. Hey, it'd be really cool if we got better at this. And so if something's not achievable till later, we don't want it to be, as a mentality. Now, something like the Pathfinder achievements, they were something that was always meant to be a roadmap to the future, but there should never be achievements that are just do 2,000 of something and one player can and the other player can't, simply based on past choices that are no longer something you can fix. I can't go back and do those things because those events are gone, unless that's going to be tied to something like the feats of strength system. And so I think that's a really, really, really good answer to kind of how they're going to handle that moving forward. That's just admitting the mistake and saying, like, here's something we'd like to go back and rectify. I think that's really good. As far as the total number of collections, there's also something that World of Warcraft's been doing that's very interesting. With the various Twitch events and things like that, they have started to go through and make things accessible that were not accessible before. And that is something that has had mixed feelings from the community as a whole. In the upcoming launch, there will be Twitch drops tied to basically all Twitch streamers that choose to stream the game with drops enabled, where people can go and get a mount that was only accessible through a card game that is discontinued, which means that long lost versions of that card with an unused code, we're trading at over $3,000, and that will now be available wide scale. Final Fantasy XIV does this through their Moogle Tombstone events. Guild Wars just works so differently, it's not really worth comparing here. And this is something where you can go back and make something accessible through a source that it was not before, as a way of utilizing things you already put in game. And the question is this good? Is this bad? Is this something we'd like to see more of? I think that in general, if it is tied to a player achievement, something like the world first rating group, a PvP ranking in a season, something that is tied to something a player did in game and achieved, that is something that I would like to see them protect and hold up. What they could do, if they want to make a nod to that, is do a reskin of a different color or something like that. And so if season 1 is red and they want season 2 to have a reward, maybe it's blue. And so I could see them reusing the same asset, but using it a little bit differently. That would be fine. And even if that's an unrelated thing, here was a dungeon reward, now it's available as a Dark Moon Fair reward, that's fine, because it is different. And that player who achieved the original could now have both. And so I think that would be totally fine. If it is, however, tied to something that simply went away, something like the trading card game, something like pre-ordering another Blizzard title, something such as the various kind of anniversary events or BlizzCon attendees, something like that. I think leaving those feats of strength tied to that in game so that they can acknowledge they went is fine, but to make the asset available through a yet another means, such as we're going to have the anniversary dragons up, and if you clear all the anniversary dragons, you can get a loot box each day you kill them, and that has a chance to drop a random BlizzCon mount you don't have. I would be totally okay with that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't devalue that I went to a BlizzCon, because I still got to go and I still got my feat of strength from it. And so like, it's still mine. It's still acknowledged. But ultimately you're just saying there's some pretty cool freaking mounts like pandas and stuff and hot air balloons, and we're going to make those available to more people. That's pretty cool. And so like, if the Spectral Tiger comes back, that's fine. I'm totally fine with that. I have friends that have cosmetics in the game from those cards. I was never able to get one of the ones that did anything, but I have friends that have some of the different kind of banners and things like that. And I don't think it kind of devalues it. They've gotten to use it for the last who knows how many years, and that's been uniquely theirs. It's not something that they're just totally devaluing their experience. They're just saying we want to make more things available in more ways. And so if Final Fantasy wants to make their Moogle Tombstone events go back and give away seasonal rewards from past seasonal events that are now in the Mog Station. I think that's totally cool, totally legit. Do that to the people that have it. They don't have to engage in that system. To the people that don't, they now have the option to. But I think it's about, are you taking away the nod to somebody's achievement? Or are you just taking away the nod to, like, I bought the collector's edition of Warcraft Reforged, and so I get the Scourge Thrower? Like, I don't know. Time has passed, and I think money is something that goes away over time. If I buy a video game when it releases at $60, I know when I buy it that one day that will be available in a $5 bin. And so I know that what I'm paying for is timed access. I'm paying to get access to now. If I pay to have a premium access to a TV show, I know at some point it's going to get lumped into some streaming service. I know that. What I don't want is somebody who achieved like a Gladiator title and that gets taken away. That's my personal take.
Because yeah, in contrast, I was looking at the mount achievement, which is a lot lower than what is currently obtainable. So I found that contrast interesting. But if you guys are looking into revisiting that, then it already kind of answers my question.
Yeah, with the mount one, I mean, I think we're looking at, just how many people, what percentage of players, what number of players have, certain numbers of mounts. We also want to be very mindful when it comes to mounts in particular. There are many that are no longer earnable. There are also many that are promotional items that from the shop or collector's editions or whatever. We don't want to create an achievement tier that feels like you have to have either these ungettable things or these promotional mounts in order to achieve it. And so while yes, for some, hardcore collectors, they're way beyond the 500 mark, we want to make sure that we're not, setting the bar in a place that feels unfair to people who are coming along today and starting to chase it.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Back to pets a little bit. Do you see a world where we could potentially play our pet battles on mobile, for example, when traveling to work? If the functionality was added to mobile where you could also progress your achievements, like there's one very popular one, the 5,000 PvP pet battle one. I think it could maybe increase participation. Or what are your thoughts on this?
I agree. Honestly, I would love to see it. I think there have been a number of technical challenges that we're still working through. It's an idea that comes up frequently that there's excitement about, but I think there's just questions of like what form it would take. Something that the mobile app doesn't do currently is like rendering actual 3D assets and pulling creatures and spell visuals and stuff into that mobile package, because again, it's just a very different technical framework. So we'd have to change a bunch of things to make it work, but completely understand the value there. Like it feels like something that, if you want to play WoW, but you're not at your computer, you can make progress in the system. It feels like a good fit and something we continue to talk about.
That's awesome to hear. Because yeah, it would be.
Okay. Final Fantasy fans have asked why we can't play Triple Triad on the mobile app. It is exactly the same request. Can I play the Pokemon battle system on there? The con is immediately the moment you say make something available to a mobile API, somebody is going to bot the living daylights out of it. And so it has to be something that can't be broken. If all it does is move up their data for Azeroth rank, that's fine. But the problem immediately becomes now everybody who goes and gathers pets while they're online and then sets up some mobile bot to grind it all to 25. Are they then going to go be able to list those on the market board for hire? Like immediately it's how do they police it? How do they enforce it? And how does it give the same quality of experience? So when he says technical hurdles, the number of technical hurdles is vast. How does it interact? How often does it refresh in real time? Is there like a refresh rate where things are kicking over? What happens if I'm logged onto the app at the same time as I am the game for that purpose? And so like these are things that like the Armory app has already had to struggle through some of these, but as you increase the number of players using it, any clumsiness that happens with how often things update or anything like that, it gets a little bit harder. I think it was Destiny that had a mobile app that allowed me to drag and drop items out of my inventory to manipulate inventories. I feel like it was Destiny that I could like use my app to an advantage while I was online. And so that's something that I've seen games start to leverage this, and to allow players to play when they're not online also becomes a question of where is the boundary. obviously from a game developer's perspective, their goal is to get as many hours of playtime as you can possibly enjoy, and it is your job to decide if that is taking away. So logging out of the game and now it is distracting you at work or when you're having a conversation with a spouse or something like that, that's your job to police. It's not their job to say, I'm having too much fun in your game. Yoshi P got this in a recent Q&A where somebody said, I'm having too much, I'm enjoying your game and I support you too much on your MOG station. Have you thought about, it was something along the lines of, can you stop me spending money on your store? Can you slow me down and restrict how often I can buy things and stuff like that? And it just, like, that's not their job. That's not their job. But I do think that there is a real question of, like, how do you make this only apply to systems that don't matter? Triple Triad, pet battles, things like that. What I don't want to see is, I think you can already manage things like your mission table garrison type stuff. You can already do this via the app. Because I feel like I was doing that at some point. Is I don't want to see it tied to any system that has a power progression component. So what I wouldn't want is them to take this feature and then go, that's very, very cool. Now can I don't know, run some limited form of content or whatever? Can I now manage something offline where now players who do not have constant 24/7 connectedness to the game take over? I know that's a far cry from pet battles, but it's just something that I'd want to bring up because I think that there's a real concern with the more things go to a mobile app, the more it feels like, are you really expecting me to play 24/7? Because the moment we get access to one thing, somebody's going to ask for more. If I can manage my triple triad, why can't I send my squadrons out on missions and have unlimited retainer access to move things around and send them out on missions? And if I can do that in these games, in World of Warcraft and Guild Wars, why can't I go manage my crafting cooldowns? And if I can do my crafting cooldowns, why can't I do buy orders and do full market board access, which Final Fantasy like heavily restricts? And if I can do that, why can't I... so now I'm sending out my ventures, I'm managing my market board, I'm participating in the small mini games. Why can't I go ahead and start using it to travel my character around? So when I log back in, I'm already there. Can I move my character to the Darkmoon Fair? Can I move my character around on flight paths? And so, like, it just starts to slowly trickle into, like, where does the lines drop? So I think at this point, what they're asking for is a very simple request. It'd be widely praised. It'd be a really good thing. I just want to make sure that when they do it, they go ahead and make very clear, here's what we're doing. And moving forward, here's the kind of mentality we have around what comes to mobile and what does not. And that may mean that there are some things that meet that criteria that's not yet in mobile. We're working on it. But there are some things that have not yet been released in game. And I can already tell you those will not be supported by mobile.
Be nice to be able to progress the little things while you're not playing, like the way that you've had missions in the past. I think it's great. All right, then back to mounts again. Shadowlands added many more mounts than any other expansion in the past. I think the number might be around the same as Legion and BFA combined or something. It's starting to get difficult to spot rare mounts from a vendor or reputation mount, especially when many of them are, potentially recolors of the same model. And so what are your thoughts on mounts being recognizable, such as, popular in the past ones like Amani Warbear or Invincible?
So there's a few pieces to that. Definitely Shadowlands had a lot of mounts. Some of that was the nature of the Covenant system and kind of times like multiplying everything by 4. Particularly early on when there was more of the sense of like pick your path. You wanted each of them to feel really complete unto itself. And then of course, as players were able to move among all of them more freely, that just became a very, very large space of not just mounts, but transmog and all the other cosmetics as well. With recolors, I think we try when possible to keep recolors at least thematically consistent in terms of where they come from, what type of activity, so that if possible, when you see someone on a mount, you at least know what portion of the game it came from. And the recolors they're often available just for pure aesthetic reasons. You want something, you have a MOG that is a specific color prominently. It's nice if we make the mount available that matches it. We do, when it comes to particular, prestige mounts in particular, we very much want to avoid too many versions of those or reusing them in other places until a lot of time has passed. Again, so that if you see someone on the Death Elemental, you know that they got Keystone Master. And it's like, yes, there's different colors for the different seasons, but it's very clear, like, that mount means dungeon achievement. Same thing for, end of raid mythic mounts. We avoid reusing those until a significant amount of time has passed. So it's striking a balance, but I think where possible, like, players who are clued in should be able to look at someone's mount and recognize, oh, you did this impressive thing to get it. And where that's not the case, it's something for us to keep working on.
Yeah, because I do agree. I think the KSM mount does stick out, different colors for different seasons. Same with gladiator mounts, and I think the mythic mount drops are also good. But yeah, I think in other places sometimes, like rare drops or vendor reputation, I think there's a little more blurring there, a lot, especially in Shadowlands.
Okay, so effectively, let me pull up a website real quick where I'm not as established as somebody like Annie Fuchsia, but this is my character on Data for Azeroth. And we go to mounts, and there are 906 mounts in game of 994 mounts total. And so this appears with things like Mog, things like mounts, these things that are aspirational, visual items that denote your achievement. Now, when a game is brand new, like New World or the upcoming Ashes of Creation or the Riot MMO, the first time they add an item that glows or a mount that looks amazing, it will stand out, because the alternative will be not having an item that glows or not having a mount that looks amazing. But as the game adds its 100th mount, its 200th mount, its 1000th mount, or the same with an axe or a chest piece or whatever, what you end up with is a diluting of how prestigious it looks. Because now somebody might not equip the latest glowing item visually because they like the way another item looks better. And that might mean that somebody feels that they don't see the people who have done the coolest stuff or whatever, because it doesn't matter. It's all about this like visual impact, and how do you decide to handle the things that are meant to matter and making sure they matter. Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars have a lot less mount skins than World of Warcraft. A lot less options. Distinguishable mount types, as well as consistent recolors of those types. World of Warcraft has both a lot of variety and a lot of doubling down on the same variety, where it's the same mount, different skin, different skin, different skin. Final Fantasy handles this really elegantly, keeping in mind it does not have nearly the scale of problem that World of Warcraft does, in that what will happen is, say, an extreme from a certain expansion will get something like ponies or birds, and then across the entire expansion, all extremes will drop a mount, and it's all a reskin of that bird or of that pony. And if you get them all, it unlocks a quest to go talk to a guy, do a neat little callback, and then you get like a golden pony or a golden bird. And so it is tied that together really cohesively. But as a result, you end up with a lot less mounts than World of Warcraft. Guild Wars, skins are just skins, and the mount itself shows its personality in the way people move through the world. And so the mount that somebody equips has a lot more to do with the type of movement they are participating in. And so you tend to see drastically different mounts, because the different mount actual asset reflects what that mount can do. Can it jump high? Can it jump far? Can it do their version of flying, which isn't quite flying like Final Fantasy and WoW do? And so it has a lot to do with what the player's objective is at the time. But in World of Warcraft, you end up blurring a lot of that through just sheer quantity. All mounts are either ground mounts or flying mounts at this point. They used to have unique mount components, like this mount can walk on water or whatever. You still have some underwater mounts and mounts that have vendors and stuff like that. But largely, a mount is either a ground mount or a flying mount. Final Fantasy used to have that, and now all mounts can fly, so it blurred that even further. So effectively, a mount is just a way of increasing your movement speed, and that's all it does. That's all it really does. There's very little utility locked behind the mount system, and it seems to be something that goes away over time in WoW, not comes forward, with the exception of additions of new types of vendors. So how do we make that significant? Well, it has to be visual. It can't be size because they have already given us large mounts. So unless they're going to give us something even larger than a Brutosaur, it can't be size. And not everybody likes big things. It can't be something that looks really crazy because they've already given us a lot of things that look really crazy. I can ride mice, I can ride dinosaurs, I can ride all sorts of different shapes of dragons and bears and horses. I can ride a wide variety. So how do they add something new that looks significant? In addition to that, how do they make sure that that is something that is scalable over time? If for the first time ever, they add a mount that has a new type of elemental glow that is more impactful than any of the glows or lightning or anything that undulates around a mount right now, well, that will look really profound at first. But what happens the next time we want to add one, and the next type we want to add one, and the next type we want to add one? WoW has a hard problem here that Ian's talking about because the game dilutes itself because it's just too big. The mistake it made is that they added too many cool things and they did it for too many years in a row. It came out of a good problem. We continually said, I want more mounts, more mounts, more mounts. And they continually said, yes, yes, yes. That's a good thing. But now the question is, I'm starting to feel like when I'm in town, I don't see mounts that are super, super cool. And so how are you going to handle that? And largely his answer is, well, when something really cool comes along, such as you cleared all the current mythic dungeons or ahead of the curve or something like that, we will go ahead and add something new that sets that apart. And if that is something seasonal in nature, we will go ahead and maybe add reskins for seasonal, but we will not use that base asset until it has been a substantial number of years. I think that's really fair. I think that's really, really fair. The only other way they could kind of handle it is they could start to force people onto it, which would, the pro would be you'd see a lot of really cool ones all being used at once. The con would be if somebody doesn't think it's cool, they'd still be using it. So if you had something tied to your weapon appearance or to your mount in this case, where when you're in Pandaland, if you're riding one of these serpents like is above my head here, you fly faster. That would encourage people, but not because it's fun or it looks cool, but because they're getting a perk. They're getting an external extrinsic effect. And I think that would really frustrate people who don't want to ride a serpent. They've already got favorite mounts, and now they feel that they can't ride those. I like the beginnings of expansions where we can't fly because it's the only time that ground mounts really get a chance to show up in my collection. Otherwise, I'm largely just on flying mounts all the time. And so because like a ton of mounts don't fly, I kind of feel that a lot of those get lost. I have a fondness for when like a Kodo shows up as an old school Tauren player, and I don't get to do that. So I don't really know it's something he can solve outside of just say it's something they're aware of. I do think one of the things they do very well is that if I target a player, there's a buff that shows up that says like, here's how fast they're moving. But that buff is titled the name of that mount, and the in-game collection system allows me to then go search that in-game and largely see where that mount came from. So if you create something that looks really neat or really on theme, it is the fact that it is aspirational in that it tells people, even that didn't know where it came from and how they can get it. I think that's really, really cool. Largely, I don't think that he can do anything to make the new mounts be something that looks cooler more consistently, unless they just find a way to like have cooler looking mounts. But then from that point forward, they're just going to be at the new coolness level. If they're like of a higher graphic fidelity, there's just going to be, all the new ones are going to be of that higher graphic fidelity, and given enough years, those are going to get diluted again. So I don't know that it's something Ian can really solve.
So it's nice to hear that you guys will, keep that in mind, maybe also for the future as well. And following up on that, I have a question about a system of mount dies. So having a way to have fewer mounts overall, but having a way to then unlock dies instead, maybe similar to a Legion artifact weapon system. Is that something that you guys have come across as an idea?
It's an idea that comes up. It's a suggestion we definitely hear. Right now, it's not one that's consistent with how our items and mounts and just visual assets are built, both artistically and from an engineering like pipeline perspective. Because it's not, WoW is known as having a painterly style, which often means sort of the literal vibe of brushstrokes and multiple combined colors in different sections. such that it's not like, oh, this piece of the shoulder pad or this piece is just solid purple or solid green and we can swap those out. And because of that nuance, it's challenging to just say, okay, replace this color with that color and have it actually functionally work. That said, we recognize and we hear loud and clear the desire for more and more and more customization. And that's in all avenues, whether it's the dragon riding mounts that we now have, whether it's creating your Drakthir, we want more depth, more variety, and that's an approach we want to continue to bring to all facets of the game.
I really like that.
All right, let's dive down that rabbit hole. So, dyes. World of Warcraft has typically offered reskins of colors as opposed to Final Fantasy and Guild Wars offering dyes. This is not just true of gear, it is true of mounts, it is true of all things in game. All assets tend to just be reskins that are predetermined. The reason for that is he argues that it really gives them a great amount of control over what that looks like. So if it fades from light to dark or something like that, that's something that they can adjust on an individual item to item basis, because each one passed through the hands of an artist instead of some screen where you got to just apply random colors. That also means when new things are added to the game, they don't have to think about every potential dye that could be applied to that item and what that might look like. They don't have to create a system that can handle that. Adding dyes to a game that is this old and has this many item IDs across either the transmog system or mounts would be a nightmare. To go back and add backwards compatibility to this would be crazy. When they added mount equipment, I thought they were going down that road. What if we allow items to be something that we can manipulate their usefulness mechanically? Except this is more the cosmetic side of that coin, and yet the mount equipment never really became something that substantially changed the game in the way that, like, the new dragon riding will change the way we move, or Guild Wars mount systems as a whole changes the way we move. So the mount equipment didn't really develop into something that was as diverse and robust as what I hoped it would. I think instead, just be better about adding more skins. Add more skins more often. But then you get back to the previous question, how do you make them feel special if there's always just 1,000 ways to get skins? I think that the collection aspect of World of Warcraft is really satisfying. When I'm out in the world and I'm doing something and I get an appearance that I've never gotten before, that's really satisfying. And by adding more color types, that handles a lot of that. And so I think going back, and especially through things where they go back and add reskins tied to promotional events or whatever, go and add more colors to things. If they don't want to add a dye system, that's fine, but just keep going down the road of reskins. If you have a reputation that sells a bunch of mounts, have it sell 10 different colors. I'm totally fine with that. And then if you want to have them show up later and throughout the expansion, add 10 more, add 10 more, add 10 more. So there's 40 different colors. The number of mounts skyrockets out of control. I think then it becomes a UI issue, and that's where it would be nice to start to see their UI say, and here are my wind serpents, and among my wind serpents, I have 15 different colors that are all the same model, but there's a total of 43 of these. Instead of having that be 43 separate lines within the thing, so it's just this infinite scroll bar, starting to create families of mounts and say, okay, this is this family, and this patch we're extending it from 43 different colors to 65 different color schemes. And some of those add armor, and some don't, and some are different colors, and some have electricity bumbling around them or whatever. I would say double down on your system before reinvent your system. They have had time and time again of this other game does this, and ultimately I think that given 10 years of development, that system ended up working out really good. Why don't you just do the one that's good? But you're really saying that system has pros and cons, our system has pros and cons. Why don't you foundationally change our system into that one? And that is a lot more headache than it's typically worth. So instead, I would say what WoW needs to do is focus on what WoW does good. WoW already is really good at reskins and introducing them. WoW is already really good at collections tabs and introducing them. And while I would love to see them continuing to move forward as they are in things like UI and all of that, instead of calling for them to, you didn't move forward enough, move forward more, I would rather say, do more of the things you're already good at. You are already really good at. And so adding more of these systems and then saying, how does the UI need to adjust with the increased quantity? This is something like the auction house change didn't really say, okay, the item generation in the game is fundamentally flawed. It said, how do we create a system that has a UI that functions really well for the item generation that our game has? Instead of fundamentally saying, you know what, let's just stop having cloth drop because it's clogging the auction house. It's how do we create an auction house that better deals with the amount of cloth that the game generates. So I think it's really good to have a lot of mounts in game, and now it needs to be, okay, what does the UI look like when the game has 5,000 mounts in it? Well, that's problematic. Do we want the game to have 5,000 mounts? Yeah, because expansions with more mounts are better. They're better. The content with more transmogs is better. Like more. So have the UI reflect what the game does well, and then let that game double down on its strengths.
I really like that, because that also then touches on the idea of potentially having dyes for transmog as well. And I think especially in transmog, that's when it's most complicated with different colors and stuff. It feels like a nice idea to be able to just unlock those by getting the dyes themselves. So that's why I wanted to see what you had to say about that. So thank you for the answer.
Absolutely. And that could definitely be cool. I think it's something that we're going to continue to talk about, but nothing specific to announce right now.
Okay. Another kind of big question, my last big question on collecting. So I would feel that it would be cool to be able as a collector to progress other professions than your main two, but currently the punishment for dropping a profession means that you'd lose your recipes, potentially the unobtainable ones. And I understand the idea of people having different professions for social and economic reasons, but is there a way to maybe restore the previously learned recipes without affecting other people?
That's something that is challenging, but that we want to make happen. It's just a question of prioritizing it against, developing other new systems and things that, how many players does it benefit? I mean, personally, myself, speaking as a player, I'm in the same boat. Like, I picked, like, the character I play is, have a blacksmithing profession that isn't super beneficial to my character personally. I picked it up back when my guild was doing Molten Core, literally 17 years ago, so I could make all the rare dark iron stuff. And I have like original vanilla Naxxramas recipes, and it's like, I'm never going to drop blacksmithing because we have things that are impossible to ever get again. Would be nice if I could change. Completely understand where the desire comes from. It's just competing against things like making the new profession system that we're excited to roll out to everybody in Dragonflight. But I think it's something that we genuinely want to tackle, and it's not a this is never going to happen thing. It's just a question of when.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I'll look.
Okay. So, crafting and gathering in World of Warcraft versus Final Fantasy versus Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2, you may have 2 active professions, and you can drop those for the other ones as far as what's active, and you can kind of hold that in the wings. In Final Fantasy XIV, you may have all 8 crafting professions simultaneously active. However, there are specialty stones that you are limited on how many can be active, but the vast majority of players have no idea what I'm talking about. World of Warcraft is like Guild Wars in that it is 2 active at any given time. However, this also includes the Gatherers, which Guild Wars does not consider a profession, and Final Fantasy does, as 3 unique gathering professions. Most games have mining and something with herbalism or chopping down trees or something like that. World of Warcraft has added the ability to pause a profession and pick up another one, but when you do that, what she noted is the cost. You drop those professions and then go back to a trainer and relearn them. And it kicks you back to your point in leveling progression and unlocks all the recipes that are tied to current content. However, my character has enchants that are no longer in game. Ian's character has blacksmithing recipes that are no longer in game. And it sounds like Annie has recipes that are no longer in game. These may still be crafted. I can still make the enchants, and I make a lot of money when I make these enchants because I'm only competing against the other people that can make those enchants. If I drop enchanting on my main and I relearn, I reactivate enchanting, I will never get those items back. They are unobtainable. The question was, can you make it to where they are obtainable so that my main could go engage in some of that rare stuff? That's a simple question so that people could be more focused. I think as the game moves account-wide, I would rather them move to things like recipes are obtained account-wide. This is how Guild Wars works. So you just learn a recipe and it just kind of handles it. And it's just accessible to all your characters that choose that profession. Final Fantasy, you go learn books, and because it's all on one character, it takes care of itself. And people who have alts, that's a very niche portion of the 14 community, people who have alts and craft on all those alts. And so in World of Warcraft, the system right now, should it be able to track that? And the question is, how many people would that even affect? It would only affect people who have professions that they want to change, that also have unobtainable professions, that would then want to go back, that care about those lost unobtainable professions. So it's a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. I think the better question is, can we bring back unobtainable recipes through the black market auction house, or better yet, through a system where we have some sort of archaeology type thing or something like that. There was some areas in Shadowlands where lore-wise it made sense, where maybe through doing dailies within our crafter, we could bring those back. Then by its very nature, those would no longer be unobtainable. They would just be difficult to obtain, which means they would start to fall under the same umbrella where their existing system is very good at reinstating patterns you know that are obtainable. So if you can just get it back into the realm of obtainable, where it's tied to a particular reputation or 3-starring something or something like that, but this starts to go back and say, we need to go back and reintroduce things into the game before Cataclysm, because that's where a lot of these exist, maybe all of these, is we need to go back to the before times and look at what recipes became unattainable and start to maybe bring those back. Vanilla Naxxramas, some of these old rare drops, whatever, bring those back. So I think that would be really exciting to just start bringing them back and make callbacks to that. And maybe there's celebratory lore events as we revisit things. Maybe people on the Dragon Isles have an interest in the world and they explored the world and they're ready to reteach us the long lost lessons of our past through engaging in a new system. And anybody that has that, just make it an optional vendor and you'll have this already known. I understand that it would take away some of the exclusivity I have. It doesn't bother me. Make more things available to more people. Games are about having fun. Let's share the fun. Go have fun. And then that would also kind of handle this. But that kind of hits on his final point. We can't invest in this because we're too busy investing in the future. This is not wildly different than when Naoki Yoshida, Yoshi P, in charge of Final Fantasy XIV, was asked in the media tour going into Endwalker whether or not they would go back and make minimum item level achievements and kind of synced-based achievements to old raids to encourage people to do those. And his biggest concern with that is that people would see them investing in old systems and say, you just spent money on my sub investing in old content because you were too lazy to do new content. You should have put it in new content for me. You're investing in content for new players and not me. And so he doesn't like spending too much time looking backward for fear that it will make people think that he is not looking forward. As the game has moved into a spare no expense mindset, he's actually been able to do both, where the game is massively moving forward and massively looking backward, and to very little criticism. So I think the answer is just do so much moving forward that nobody can criticize you of that. But World of Warcraft, with professions specifically, if you want to hear a rant, go look up WTV Gold, Want to Buy Gold, and go listen to Reckles talk about this in some of his longer videos. But ultimately, TLDR, World of Warcraft has done a terrible job keeping crafting and gathering a consistently maintained thing from expansion to expansion. Every expansion's drops work a little bit differently. Every expansion's crafting works a little bit differently. Sometimes we can 3-star recipes, sometimes we can't. Sometimes we need to drop things in a scrapper, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's tied to open world questing or tools of the trade, sometimes it's not. Sometimes items have tiers to them, sometimes they don't. Sometimes items take these kind of like primals and stuff that are farmed in the open world. Otherwise, it's more of like a bind-on pickup item, and it changes every single time. And so Dragonflight saying it's moving the needle forward, no, it's not. Because based on every other expansion within World of Warcraft, it's just moving it somewhere different. That somewhere different may be super advanced in some way, may have people super excited, but ultimately, until a system can be cohesive 2, and heaven forbid, 3 expansions in a row, I have no reason to believe that what Dragonflight is doing with crafting is a mentality shift at all. It is simply a shift in focus, and to people that maintain crafters that craft things across multiple expansions, every single expansion works a little bit differently. How do I get this recipe? How do I get the items for it? How do I craft it? Does crafting it get cheaper as I do it more, or do some quest progression tied to it, or some crap like that? And it's different every single time. And this is one of the reasons that, unlike Guild Wars and unlike Final Fantasy, you do not level crafting in World of Warcraft cohesively in one continuous time frame. You actually just level that expansions. So if you want to get into crafting and gathering in Dragonflight, you will level Dragonflight crafting and gathering. Imagine if in Final Fantasy, instead of starting at level 1 and doing whatever of the many methods to level up, you speed leveled into the current 80 and 90 content to do all the stuff in the 80 to 90 content. Imagine if instead it was a nice slow progression, but that once you finished catching up with the Endwalker crafting and gathering, and you decided you wanted to go in to get into Heavensward crafting and gathering, you had not yet done the leveling portion of that. It is totally independent. They've broken it down into separate levels. And it helps keeps the total number of levels fairly reasonable, as opposed to Guild Wars where the level's at like 500 or something stupid. So when you're leveling, it's like, because there's way too many. And it helps separate systems that work differently, like the Final Fantasy system, where what ends up happening is the parts of those systems that made them complex go away over time because you're a little overpowered. They literally added an ability in recent expansions to Final Fantasy XIV called Trained Eye that basically allows you to just auto beat the complex things from a lot, but not all, of previous expansions content. Anything that's not an expert craft is now just more cheesable than ever before. And so instead it says, you know what, if we made a hard grind, let's keep it a hard grind, but let's keep that separate for when you want to do it after you're done with the current serving. After all, the current serving is what shows on the launcher. The current serving is what shows up in advertisements. The current serving is what shows up in Twitch and YouTube. The current serving is what gets you into the game. People don't say, come join me in Warlords of Draenor past content. They say, come join me in the upcoming Dragonflight. People focus on the current expansion. So just let the crafting be that thing. But it also solved the problem that their systems are just disconnected. Crafting and gathering is just a wildly different system from one expansion to the next in World of Warcraft. And it's something I'd love to see them fix. It feels like, I can't speak to the internal, but it feels like there is not a cohesive development team in charge of crafting and gathering. That there's just a bunch of people that are qualified to do it, and every time an expansion comes up, they just go, hey bud, it's your turn. Why don't you give it a shot? And that person, not at all looking into what the existing system's doing, what the previous systems going into it's doing, what the feedback around those systems are doing, go, well, it's finally my turn. You know what would be cool? And then they just freaking wing it. And so that means anything we like about the Dragonflight system has a massive risk of being thrown right into the garbage when we move into 11.0 as far as what the 11.0 system will do. The 10.0 system will probably still work for anybody that wants to go back and do 10.0 stuff after it becomes cosmetic only. But that's weird. That's weird. They tried to tie it all together with time-worn artifacts, and then even those were weird. The whole thing's weird.
Look forward to hopefully one day being able to do that. On the topic of mounts that become unobtainable later, like Gladiator, Keystone, Master, ahead of the curve, has the idea, or what do you guys feel about potentially some of those coming back, you know, maybe several expansions later?
I think that's very unlikely.
Very unlikely.
You know, some of those particular mounts, those rewards, titles in the same vein exist at times to mean you were there, you did the thing, and if you missed it, you missed it. The vast majority, like 99% plus of all of the rewards across World of Warcraft of every type are things that you can go back and get years later. You can go back and kill old mythic raid bosses and get their titles. You can farm up their mounts. But there is a handful of things in the space that really are about, you know, you were part of an experience, and if you see someone with it, you know that they did it while it mattered. And so we don't want to expand that space too much, but I think we're likely to preserve it as it stands.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's one of the popular.
Great job. Great answer. This is a very similar answer to how you say, how do you deal with what you put on the microtransaction marketplace? The MOG station, the Battle.net store, all of these games. How do you handle skins when you talk about these weapon skins, these mount skins, these pets? How do you handle that? How do you handle when you gave something exclusive to people for participating in or achieving something truly unique? Not, oh, they played during a seasonal event and they did the quest line and now that seasonal event's not around, but things like Gladiator, things like Ahead of the Curve, where they didn't just show up, they didn't just take part, but they dominated. They mastered. They really, truly did something. They really did. They really took part heavily in a PvP season or in a piece of raid content. How do you handle that versus seeing these kind of TCG mounts come back? The answer is you leave those alone. If we said, if you are going to be somebody who PvPs to level 500 of PvP in a particular season and you do it, we will protect that for all of time. If you pre-ordered a game and later we make that available through pre-ordering a different upcoming expansion, tough beans. Tough beans. But Arena, Feast, all of these type little small PvP zones, if you are the best team in a season and they give you a unique mount to the top 1% of players, they should keep that for being in the top 1%. They earned that. How do you then rationalize that with a player base that has new players that were never given the opportunity, or players that were there but didn't make it, or players that didn't like PvP back then but now they do? Shouldn't those players get a chance? No, because those players do have a chance at the current ones, because we're continuing to do systems like that, and we overwhelmed you. The system has 99% of mounts are available to you right now. When a system has 1,000 mounts and over 900 of those are available to current players, you're saying that's fine. 90% of the mounts in game you can still get. As a matter of fact, not only can you still get, but most of them are easier to get now than when they were first added. Going back and fighting a raid boss on its hardest difficulty to get a rare chance at a mount, you can now go back and solo in many cases until it drops its mount. In some of these games, you can go back and do it multiple times. So you can go back on World of Warcraft on multiple characters and blast it down each week, even though it's an account-wide drop. You can go back in Final Fantasy and do extreme mount farms, and you can just blast these things down. And so you can totally devalue things that were never meant to be truly exclusive. They were just meant to be something that was hard to get, but everybody could get at the time, and you can leave those things special. If somebody goes to a PvP invitational and wins, and you give them a unique transmog or mount, that needs to be theirs forever. If, however, there is something tied to a PvP mode, and that PvP mode gets removed, but every freaking player in the world had it back then, and a new PvP mode gets added, and you want to add that mount to that, that's fine. That's fine. But we are talking about, the idea is the way you make it okay to respect some things to that degree is that A, things like reskins can get you really close. So don't be like, that's the only dinosaur mount in the game. Give us other freaking dinosaurs. And B, you can say, you know what? There is so many. When they add 5 mounts to the store, but they add 45 mounts to the game over the same 6-month period, it's not a big deal. But if the game adds 10 mounts to the store and 1 mount to the game, it starts to be like, oh, I understand. Paying a subscription and playing your game isn't enough for you. So I think that its perspective is heavily shifted by what is the sheer quantity of things in game. Are there really cool ones available to a wide variety of players doing a wide variety of activities on a wide variety of definitions of time gating? And that's what makes it okay to not get every single skin, because I can still get something I'm excited about. And then only respect the things that need to be respected. I don't feel that, like, if Cataclysm overwrote a vanilla zone and that had a mount tied to it, that needs to be respected. Because it's not like people were doing that content back then at an elite level because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm doing the Baron's pro level because one day Cataclysm's going to overwrite this. As opposed to Gladiator, FOMO's part of it. It is. It feels good. You're proud of that mount, and you deserve for that to be protected. I don't know. It's a fine line, I understand.
The questions I hear from new players, especially ahead of the curve mounts. So I totally understand your point. I just wanted to bring it forward to see what you'd say on it. So I think we're nearing the end, but I thought maybe I'd just throw some real quick questions. Achievement. It's over 9,000. Are we going to get another one for a higher number?
Are there any other meme numbers? above for that. I mean, let me know. I can think of a couple. They're maybe not so appropriate for a T14 rated game.
I wasn't going to mention that.
But,
yeah, we're not quite there yet. But yeah,
exactly.
I guess there's no numbers around 30, no meme exactly. So, okay, so meme numbers, that's what it is, basically. That's what it takes.
Pretty much. That was 100%.
Gotcha. RBGs for groups of 5 to 6 people.
Yes, I think BGs, the size of BGs, is something we're definitely looking at and talking about a lot. I think looking at, effectively solo queue in the form of rated solo shuffles, interesting experiment that may lead to something in a similar space in Battlegrounds down the line. It's something, we've heard a lot from the community.
Mm-hmm.
So stay tuned. We'll have more to talk about later on in Dragonflight.
Cool. Nice.
Cool.
Import-export features now in the game and talents and such. Are we going to get one for sharing our customization of the Dracthyr?
That's something we'd like to do. It's come up a lot, actually. People who, either have spent 15 minutes making their Dracthyr and then realize they picked the wrong faction, or something comes up and they have to back out and they're like, I had it perfect. I want to save this. Or you see someone else's and you want to, copy the setup. That's something we're going to look into.
Cool. Yeah, I found myself making 2 Dracthyrs on 2 separate servers, and I'm like, it would be nice if I could just copy it. Final question. Which dragon aspect would you rather be stranded on an island with, and why?
Would we really be stranded with any of them? They're all dragons that can fly. Like, how do you get stuck on an island if you're a dragon?
Maybe there's invisible walls. Okay, you can't get out.
Well, okay, then my very serious answer is going to be the future leader of the Black Dragonflight.
Oh.
Whoa.
Okay. Good answer. Awesome. Well, thank you. And I think that is the end of our time together. Cool. Thank you so much, Ian, for taking your time to talk about stuff. This has been really exciting for me. I was very nervous about this, but it started feeling better as further into the interview we got. So yeah, thank you so much.
No, it was a complete pleasure chatting. So thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
What a tease! What a tease! Way to just be like, I know something you don't know, and it's gonna be awesome. Oh man, cool. I like that. That was a really nice job. Ian, over the years, has done a lot of interviews sometimes, not so many interviews the other times. The answer to how to get better for these is to sit down and do them. Naoki Yoshida gives a ton of interviews. He does live presentations. He's done 74 of those. He does a ton of written letters. And he very much engages in his community to know what the thoughts are around those. So I think he's had a chance to get better and better and better and better. And Ian, just in recent history, has gotten substantially better since the Preach interview. I think there were a lot of things here where he even self-admitted when one of his answers was flimsy. I wish he'd had just a better answer than a flimsy one, but to recognize in real time, this isn't a great representation of kind of the thoughts in this limited format that we have over a much larger format of internal discussions. To recognize that and acknowledge it, to recognize and acknowledge openly and readily that there are many ways of experiences in his game. If you take everything he says across an expansion, he celebrates that his game has multiple ways to play. But it's sometimes, if you just see a clip of a particular segment, it seems like that's forgotten sometimes, and that's a little bit lost, that the internal definition of reality does not line up with all of our experiences of reality. And so then it feels like you're dismissing kind of how the game plays for us and what our immediate circle of friends and family might be experiencing in game. So I think he did a good job of expressing kind of where they're at, where they're going, why some of those things are, touched on a lot of things. And as far as like, without just asking for Andy to have asked a different set of questions, I think this was really, really, really well done. She did a great job of hitting a wide variety of topics. And kind of explaining the question in a way where none of it feels like he answered a different question than she asked. Sometimes he did tee it up into saying, I'm going to answer your question and then some. And sometimes she said, I'm going to give you a suggestion, but also ask a question. So they both kind of played up their opportunity here as far as a chance to kind of communicate with the other side really clearly and openly. But largely, I was really happy with this. Way to go, Ian. Do more of these. Do these regularly. Keep getting better at them. And keep selecting big, well-spoken creators from across the community, because they're the ones that the reason that they are successful big creators is not that they're the only people that speak well and know the game very well, but it does kind of pre-vet things. It tells you there's a substantial portion of the base that believes these people know what they're talking about. And so they're not the only people, but if you start to try to open it up to anybody with an opinion, it gets a lot harder to tell where it is. And so I think it makes sense to say, okay, now let's go talk to Hazel. Now let's talk to Preach. Now let's talk to Asmund. Now let's talk to Bellular. Now let's talk to Science of Kalani. Now let's talk to, Towley. Now let's talk to, and just jumping around and around. And in theory, that's what the media tour does. I think also giving interviews to anybody that comes into the space and takes it by storm. Like if the Guild Wars 2 interviews would give an interview to Zepla, who has come in and just topped their directory. That's an acknowledgement to come in and say, I'd love to know what your initial thoughts are. I can't promise we're going to change the game based on, you with under 100 hours, but I'd love to publicly kind of take on some of the common pros and cons of being a new player in our game. And as World of Warcraft tries to draw in a fresh generation, I would love to see them take on people who try WoW for the very first time and give interviews to them, see what they think. And take part in that. And maybe it's something that's more like a media tour, and maybe each person only gets to ask 1 to 2 to 3 questions. Final Fantasy's been doing over recent history these kind of 44 person interviews. They're really 42. They're 40. 24 man raids is 48. But it's 24. But it's 20. Yeah, it's 44. So Final Fantasy's been doing these 44 question interviews, and they give each of 44 people 1 question. And I think that would be a neat way of doing it, but just generally communicating with the community more. So if you're not going to set up a format where you do these roundtables more often, then I think more Q&As, more interviews, where somebody else does the job of thinking about what do people want to know more about, and you're just there to respond. You can pre-vet these, so you can go ahead and ask for all the questions in advance so that he can make sure that he's up to date on all that, so that if he needs to reference a data point or something, you avoid what some of the live Q&A formats come up with, where they go, I can't really talk about that more, or you're going to hear about that in an upcoming event or an upcoming news post. And so they end up being kind of wasted questions. So you can pre-vet those. So maybe you collect 100 questions and you just pick your favorite 44. That can get accused of cherry picking, but what it ultimately does is it causes sometimes you end up with these my priest is actually 2% worse than the current other person in my party, and what are you gonna do about that? And then doesn't help anything. We don't move anything forward. And so I think he did a really good job here. I think he communicated very clearly. I think there was a warmth, and I think that not approaching it just so literally and saying, yeah, I am somebody who knows optimal play, and I'm never gonna drop my profession on my character because I like my unobtainables, and that's really important to me. I think reminds you that he does play this game, he did play this game, and he knows a lot about this game. And sometimes when he kind of talks into lawyer game director speak, that coldness kind of causes that to get lost. Yes, technically his answer might be more technically correct. It might be more defendable from a legal standpoint, and it's more precise. But if you do these more often, we don't expect you to be precise because you've been answering the same question across 10 different times. And so we can kind of put those 10 together and be like, yeah, I mean, you're picking on that one word choice that one time, but he also answered that question over these other 9 events. And so we kind of get that was just him talking. And I think Naoki Yoshida can really lean on that. And so when people go, well, I quoted him here and he got it wrong. And it's like, okay, except that he's also addressed it 14 other times. And so I think you're getting a mistranslation there. And so maybe that's an advantage of the fact that he speaks Japanese, but is trying to be a global developer for a global game, as opposed to Ian gets to rely on his native language. And so he's maybe expected to be a little more accurate as an English speaker. So maybe people that don't receive Ian's words in English would have a better chance at being able to understand that. But I think he did a great job. I think he did a great job of kind of handling this. And ultimately, I think this interview, if anything, just got me more excited about Dragonflight. which as I sit here on my Death Knight, which is like, I literally changed my UI so much, I don't even have abilities on the bar. So I need to just kind of like, I only dragged enough on to do this event. So I'm going to hop down here and get back to power leveling this while unlocking all these unique cosmetics. I have 39 of 49, none of them tied to Dark Knight, none of them are plate anymore, but I'm going to go ahead and work through that and get some more of these Primeval Essence, get some more characters from that 50 to 60 gap. I'm 53 currently, and thank you. Thank you to Annie, thank you to Ian, and thank you to the 4, I've been told now 5 members that support gaming kind of more directly. And thanks to everybody that comes and hang out with me while I film these live on Twitch.